Warm welcome today to Sophie and Gemma, James Brokenshires' daughters, who have come to hear this today. Theresa May needs no introduction. Prime Minister from 2016 to 2019, Home Secretary for a long spell, and a Conservative MP for Maidenhead since May 1997. We're delighted to have you here. Your phrase, "Remember the good that government can do," is a phrase that has stuck with me since I began this job 6 years ago. This lecture does need a bit of introduction, though, and to explain why we're so pleased to be hosting it. As you know, James Brokenshire served in Theresa May's cabinet between 2016 and 2019, first as Northern Ireland Secretary, then as Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government. And very sadly, he died from cancer in 2021. And today's lecture is in memory of James and will reflect on the theme of public service, which was central to his life and career, as anyone who had anything to do with him knew. And before I invite Mrs. May to give her lecture, I'm going to ask Sir Jeremy Wright MP, the former Attorney General and a close colleague of James, who together with Chloe Smith MP has helped put together today's lecture, just to say a few words. Jeremy.
Thank you, Bronwyn. Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be able to say just a few words before we hear from Theresa. James Brokenshire was many things. He was a father to Sophie and Gemma, who are very welcome here today, and of course to Ben. He was a friend and colleague to many of us, but he was also a consummate, effective and dedicated public servant. And what Chloe and I were thinking over the last few months was that it would be right to commemorate James's commitment to public service and to fill what we saw as a gap, because you will not have failed to notice that there have been plenty of discussions recently about how public servants have failed to come up to the standards of public service expected of them. But there hasn't been much discussion of what good public service looks like and why it's important. And so we hoped that this would be an opportunity to discuss those things as a fitting tribute to someone who encapsulated them and who demonstrated not just why public service was important, but also how it could be done well. So I'm immensely grateful to the Institute for Government, to Bronwyn, and particularly to Hannah White, if I may say so, for all the hard work that's been done to make this happen. Chloe and I, of course, have had many discussions with them, but all of the organisation, I think, largely has been done by the IFG, so we're grateful to you for that. And grateful to everyone here and everyone listening online too, for participating in what I hope will be a fitting tribute, not just to James, but a commemoration of him and a reminder that for now and for the future, public service really matters. And in that vein, it's an even greater pleasure to have Theresa delivering this lecture, a Prime Minister whose commitment to public service, I think, has never been in doubt. So, Theresa, we're grateful to you for doing it, and I'm sure we look forward very much to what you have to say. Bronwyn, thank you.
Jeremy Wright, thank you very much indeed. A few words of housekeeping before we kick off. As you'll see on the screen above me, please submit your questions via Slido. We're not going to have a vast amount of time for questions, but I will at least see them coming in and do what I can. We'll be live tweeting these events from our IFG events account, and the hashtag is IFG Brokenshire. And with that, Theresa May, thank you very much indeed for coming to give this talk on restoring faith in politics.
Thank you very much, Bronwyn, for that introduction, and I am genuinely delighted to be able to join you all today to give this James Brokenshire Memorial Lecture, and particularly delighted that Sophie and Gemma are here to join us today too. And I do congratulate you on your timing, Bronwyn. What a week in which to hold this lecture. But for the avoidance of doubt, this is the speech I would have given regardless of circumstances. Because this is a speech in memory of James Brokenshire, and I would also like to thank Cathy Brokenshire, Jeremy White, Chloe Smith and the Institute for Government for the work in establishing the lecture. It is, I believe, a fitting and lasting memorial to James, who was not just a valued and trusted colleague, but also a wonderful friend. And I can think of no better place to give this lecture than here at the Institute for Government. This is an organisation dedicated to making government more effective. Dare I say it, effective government needs effective ministers. And I can think of no more effective minister than the late James Brokenshire. James joined the Home Office as one of my junior ministers, already highly knowledgeable on home affairs, having shadowed the brief for 4 years. He served first as Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Crime Reduction, then for Crime and Security, then as Minister for State for both security and immigration, grappling at once with two of the most important and complex areas of policy. In fact, I recall the then Permanent Secretary remarking that as James was responsible for 2/3 of Home Office business, what on earth were the other ministers going to do? On becoming Prime Minister, I appointed James to the Cabinet as Secretary of State for Northern Ireland and subsequently as Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government. And he was, of course, later reappointed to the Home Office as Minister of State for Security under the new government. James was respected by all those he worked with, and civil servants liked working with him. He took the time to understand the issues, thought carefully about them, and would challenge officials when necessary. But they always knew that the challenge came because he wanted the policy to work. He wanted government to be effective. He was always respectful of officials, understanding that good government requires politicians and civil servants to work together as a team, everyone determined to provide the best practical solution for the public we all serve. When thinking about James and why he was so effective, 3 elements come to mind, and it's these 3 that I want to develop in this lecture as I address this issue of restoring faith in politics. And those 3 elements are, firstly, that he was a good constituency MP, recognising that it is in the constituency that we can see the impact of policy. Secondly, James respected Parliament, understanding the importance of the scrutiny that Parliament provides. He accepted both that Parliament can improve legislation and that sometimes there has to be compromise in order to get legislation through. Another element of this was his willingness to work across the House to find solutions. This came most naturally in relation to his work as Security Minister, but in other areas, numbers. And thirdly, he knew that ministers have to get to grips with the issues. It isn't good enough just to wing it or prioritise getting the headlines. An effective minister takes the time and trouble to really get into the detail of the issue. James was a dependable, safe pair of hands, and I always had confidence in him. But when I look back at the sort of man he was, James wasn't merely competent. He was unmistakably somebody with deep-rooted values. He exemplified decency, honesty, and integrity, values that I believe are essential in public life if we are to have faith in our politics. As was remarked at his memorial service, James came into politics to serve, not to be served. I have said before that Parliament is the worse off without James. I would also say that our politics and Parliament would be more likely to be trusted by the public if there were more politicians who clearly showed they shared James's values. Public service was perhaps James's strongest motivation. He was a consummate member of Parliament. He knew that his increasingly successful ministerial career was only possible because his constituents had sent him to Parliament on their behalf. And he didn't just represent their views, he was deeply embedded within the local community. He brought people together and through service to his constituents earned their respect. In our modern representative democracy, it's no longer enough simply to turn up at Parliament and shuffle through the voting lobbies. The public rightly expect us to be fighting their corner, taking up their concerns, visible in the community, and working for them on local issues and interests. They expect us to be making a tangible difference to their everyday lives. This was a concept often misunderstood by fellow ministers internationally. I particularly remember one of my opposite numbers when I was Home Secretary, remarking on the peculiar arrangement in the UK of being both a minister and an MP and asking what it was like. I replied, put it this way, Today I am at this international summit discussing counter-terrorism. Tomorrow I will open a community vegetable garden. While these seemingly frivolous constituency engagements might not have the glamour of international summits, they've always been just as important to me, and I know that was a view shared by James Brokenshire too. I spoke on my last appearance at the Dispatch Box as Prime Minister about the vital link between every single member of the House and the constituencies we represent. I called it the bedrock of our parliamentary democracy and our liberty, because without strong relationships with the communities we serve, how can we expect to build faith in our politics as a whole? The strong relationship James had with his local community is particularly inspiring at a time when trust in politicians has been eroded. A recent YouGov poll for the IPPR found that 63% of people believe their politicians are merely out for themselves. More shockingly, 5%, just 1 in 20 people, believe that MPs are in it for the interests of their country. A recent poll for Carnegie UK found that over 3/4 of the population don't trust MPs very much or at all. Now, distrust in politics is not a new issue. We were asking the same questions of the public 80 years ago. The difference is, when asked in 1944, just 35% of the population agreed that politicians were out for themselves, compared to 2/3 of people today. The Carnegie survey also identified 9 values, often thought of as being desirable in public life, and asked people which they felt was most important. Almost half of the representative sample chose honesty and integrity. By contrast, fewer than 5% of people prioritised other values, including individual liberty and strength and security. Of those who most valued honesty and integrity, only 8% agreed the government has this value. The figures make for sobering reading. But they demonstrate that if we are to accommodate voters' priorities, we ought to be placing at least as much, if not more, emphasis on improving honesty and integrity in public life as we do in other areas of public policy. Those of us engaged in politics must grasp just how significantly the electorate feel their expectations are not being met. One of the fundamental expectations of the people we represent is that we play by the rules. No double standards, no taking advantage of the position one holds. It's that inherently British sense of fair play, originally popularised, of course, through our nation's greatest sport, cricket. A game that, in a time of empire, inequality and class divide, brought together aristocrats and labourers on an equal footing under one set of rules. In cricket, it's not enough to avoid breaking the rules. In fact, the game requires adherence to its traditions as much as its laws. Law 41. The captains are responsible for ensuring that play is conducted within the spirit of cricket as well as within the laws. Respect is essential. Respect of one's teammates, the opposition, and the authority of the umpire. And players must create a positive atmosphere by their own conduct and encourage others to do likewise. For any action which is seen to abuse this spirit causes injury to the game itself. I take the same view of politics. Breaking the rules and breaking the spirit of the rules causes injury to the standing of our democracy. In politics, of course, playing by the rules means following the law, and it's not unreasonable to expect those of us who write the law of the land to follow its letter and spirit. It also means adhering to the rule of law, the doctrine that all people and institutions, including the state itself, are accountable under the law as it stands. It protects the liberty of the individual against the arbitrary use of power. It underpins political and economic stability and our standing in the wider world. And as I've said before, we cannot claim as a country to operate in line with the rule of law if we flagrantly abuse our own obligations under treaties we have signed. Playing by the rules also means not changing them on a whim to suit
And let me say now to the people of Ukraine that I know that we in the UK will continue to back your fight for freedom for as long as it takes. And at the same time, in this country, we've been pushing forward a vast programme of investment in infrastructure and skills and technology, the biggest in a century.
Mayor inversión del siglo y todo ello porque creemos en el talento, en la imaginación, en el coraje del pueblo británico, porque consideramos que se merecen sus oportunidades y por eso tenemos que seguir liberando el potencial que